We are going to keep reviewing Richard Dawkins' new book, Outgrowing God. And in particular, this week, we're going to look at his comments on warfare in the Bible and just rip it apart by shreds. This is Matthew Garnett. Welcome to In Layman's Terms.
Why doesn't God seem to speak to people anymore as he did to Abraham? In parts of the Old Testament, he seemingly couldn't keep his mouth shut. He seemed to speak to Moses almost every day, but nobody hears a peep from him today, or if they do, we think they need psychiatric help. Did that in itself ever make you wonder whether those old stories might not be true?
And I think it's better than the way it's being run.
Okay, so we're going to keep looking at Richard Dawkins' book, Outgrowing God, this week, particularly his comments on war. We might have delved into that a bit this week, but I think we can really bring some good material to bear on this. Just a warning to those of you out there who might have small children or even teenagers or whoever you don't want listening to some fairly graphic descriptions of how warfare is conducted even in modern times. This is not the podcast for children. It really is not. So fair warning ahead of time. I want to welcome everybody listening on KNNA The Cross in Nebraska. Also, thank you to Steve Kozar and the messedupchurch.com for having us there. Check out the messedupchurch.com. There are tons of resources just like this one, just like this podcast here, Layman's Terms Radio.org. That you can access there. This is really going to branch you out, and what we really do pride ourselves on there is our critiques of North American religion and Christianity, and that's what we do. We want to point you in the right direction on these things. So check out the messedupchurch.com. Also, go to laymanstermsradio.org right now. Stop the podcast. Go there and donate $5, $10, or $15 because you're listening to this podcast right now, and you should donate $5, $10, or $15 per podcast, because if you do that, we've got enough listeners, we can fund this well. We need to raise about $30,000. We're looking into some other ways maybe we can help out there, or perhaps get the well established at a lower cost. But for now, we need you to donate $5, $10, or $15 at laymanstermsradio.org. These kids don't need to have, as part of their curriculum, their daily curriculum, going down to rivers and streams and scooping buckets of water out of there so they can get through a school day. That's just ridiculous. So let's take care of this. $5, $10, or $15, or go to our GoFundMe. You can find all that on our landing page at laymanstermsradio.org. Donate a one-time gift of $50. Thank you to all of you who have given. We are starting to chip away at it, but it's just it's kind of hit and miss. Some of it's an 80-20 thing, and it can't be that way, folks. We're not going to raise this money if it keeps being an 80-20 thing. We can't have 20% of you who listen giving 80% of or 100% of the donations and make this work. We've got to have everybody on board with this, and it's not complicated. We're not asking you to make any long-term commitments. We're just asking you to do this for a month's time, $5, $10, or $15 to listen to the podcast. Okay, please donate to the Kenya Well Project. All right, we don't have a lot of time because I'm going to play some extended clips from Jocko Willink's podcast called the Jocko Podcast, and I would recommend that podcast to you. It is it's something I've been aware of for a while, but didn't really know what he did. I thought he was more about leadership principles, and I'm not really in any kind of leadership position per se. I thought he was more, and he does do the self-help, that sort of thing type of deal. But to listen. What the main thing he does is he interviews. He's a former Navy SEAL that served in Ramadi, which was one of the big hot spots in Iraq, and he talks with his former Navy SEAL buddies about that. He also talks with other war veterans from other eras of war, including World War II, Vietnam, etc. And we're going to play a little bit of that. He also reviews books on his podcast, and we're just going to illustrate the point of just war here, and just completely shred Dawkins and all the new atheist positions on this when it comes to how they understand the Bible. And we're going to explain all that as we go. Again, we've got very extended clips of the Jocko podcast on here. Two of them are 15 minutes in length each, but I want you guys to hear these soldiers describe what the enemy is like that they faced. And what the enemy was like that we faced in a couple of wars. One was World War II, and one is the latest Gulf War. And I want you to hear that, and then I want to contrast that with Dawkins' nonsense on how he thinks that the Bible is just talking about another form of Naziistic land grabs is really what the Bible's talking about, and that's complete bunk, and we're going to prove it here. Let's get cracking on this. Here we go.
Syphilis was studied. Many female Marutas died as Unit 731 endeavored to solve the venereal disease epidemics raging through the ranks of Imperial Japanese Army as its military hordes marauded around the Asian continent. On one occasion, a pregnant woman was deliberately infected with the disease, and when her child was born, both were dissected. Cruel experiments were not confined to the roadblock. 5 hours from Pingfan, by truck, lay Anta Proving Ground. Unit 731's Education Division Chief, Lieutenant Colonel Nishi, took part in one experiment. Here are his comments. An experiment in which I participated was performed in infecting 10 Chinese war prisoners with gas gangrene. The object of the experiment was to ascertain whether it was possible to infect people with gas gangrene at a temperature of 20 degrees Celsius below zero. This experiment was performed in the following way. 10 Chinese war prisoners were tied to stakes at a distance of 10 to 20 meters from a shrapnel bomb that was charged with gas gangrene. To prevent the men from being killed outright, their heads and backs were protected with a special metal shield and thick quilted blankets, but their legs and buttocks were left unprotected. The bomb was exploded by means of an electric switch, and the shrapnel, bearing gas gangrene germs, scattered all over the spot where the experimentees were bound. All the experimentees were wounded in the legs or buttocks, and 7 days later, they died in great torment. Miraculously, some Marutas survived all infection experiments, developing remarkable immunities. But their fate was always the same. Unit 731 had many other uses for human fodder. So they talk about this in the book, how some people would develop immunity. Some guys were just super tough, just tough. And in fact, there's one where they talk about they finally kill this guy after experiment. He was a 65-year-old guy. He was just tough. He survived all these different infections, all these different diseases, and they finally, when they kill him, they open him up, they dissect him, and they see that he's like got the organs of a 25-year-old or something. But it didn't matter. Even if you were resistant to diseases, they had other experiments to do. The education chief, Nishi, had some other recollections about some of those other experiments. Back to the book. With temperatures below negative 20 degrees Celsius, people were brought out from the detachment's prison into the open. Their arms were bared and made to freeze with the help of an artificial current of air. This was done until their frozen arms, when struck with a short stick, emitted a sound resembling that which a board gives out when it is struck. A film was made on this subject too. Here's another account of these. So they were trying to figure out things about frostbite and what people could take, because they were going to be fighting up in the steppes of Manchuria and Russia. They thought they'd be fighting there, so they had to do experiments to figure out how to heal frostbite once it happened and how much cold someone could take. Here's a printer that worked there, and here's a account of what he witnessed. 2 naked men were put in an area 40 to 50 degrees below zero, and researchers filmed the whole process until they died. They suffered such agony, they were digging their nails into each other's flesh. This was military life. You couldn't say, I want to do this or that in war, however good or bad. The Japanese way is to obey a superior. It was the same as if the order came from the emperor. Sometimes there were no anesthetics. They screamed and screamed. But we didn't regard the logs as human beings. They were lumps of meat on a chopping block. The Japanese way is to obey a superior. I talk about that all the time. You got to question. You got to question. Continuing. Detachment 731 had a sister unit. It was called the 716 Chemical Warfare Unit. Tests were carried out in a large cloud chamber the size of a telephone box. Made of thick steel, it had an agitator in the ceiling connected by large pipes to a gas-producing machine. Marutas were put in a truck, tied to a pole, and pushed inside, some naked, some in full army uniform, and some in gas masks. 731 and 516 researchers watched them gasp and convulse to their deaths through the chamber's reinforced glass window. A young mother and her baby were even put to death in this chamber. She desperately tried to protect her child from the fumes by covering it with her body. She died lying on top of her child. Here's another account from a medical orderly about other experiments beyond cold and beyond chemical and beyond biological. Here we get to malnutrition. I saw malnutrition experiments. They were conducted by the project team under the technician Yoshimura. He was a civilian member of Unit 731. The purpose of the experiments, I believe, was to find out how long a human being could survive with just water and biscuits. 2 Marutas were used for this experiment. They continuously circled a prescribed course within the grounds of the unit, carrying approximately a 20-kilogram sandbag on their backs. One succumbed before the other, but they both ultimately died. The duration of the experiment was about 2 months. They only received army biscuits to eat and water to drink, so that they would not have been able to survive for very long. They weren't allowed a lot of sleep either. And here's one of the major generals, Kawashima, and he talks about the fate of some of the Marutas. From 500 to 600 prisoners were consigned to Detachment 731 annually. If a prisoner survived the inoculation of lethal bacteria, this did not save him from a repetition of the experiments, which continued until death from the infection supervened. The infected people were given medical treatment in order to test various methods of cure. They were fed normally, and after they had fully recovered, were used for the next experiment, but infected with a different kind of germ. At any rate, no one ever left this factory alive. Following anatomical study, the bodies of the dead were burned in the detachment's incinerator. So as I said, there's, even if you're just tough as nails, they're just going to give you a different disease or more disease. And all pretty horrible, and now it gets worse. Back to the book. Perhaps the greatest horror of Unit 731 was vivisection. Unit 731 had 2 teams of pathologists, one headed by Dr. Akamoto, the other by Dr. Ishikawa. Anatomical study performed by these squads was not always confined to the dead. Pathology squad assistant Kirum Zawa saw vivisections. Unit 731 did work on living human bodies, he said. To do this work, our sentiments were suppressed. So this is a whole new level. We're actually dissecting or vivisecting people that are alive. Back to the book. Some doctors are said to have come all the way from Japan just to see such a dissection. Laboratory assistants got extra pay, called the chemical weapons allowance, for wielding the scalpel during this dreadful work. Blood is said often to have spurted all over the ceiling of the dissection room as certain incisions were made. Limbs of the dying Marutas would flex and jerk involuntarily as the scalpel entered particular parts of the brain. Organs would twitch vigorously after they were thrown into jars of formalin for preservation. Not only were anesthetics researched, but also bizarre surgical experiments connecting different parts of the body are reported to have been performed. So, yeah, this is a horror movie that's actually happening. You got sewing different parts of the body together. This is just a horror movie, except this is not a movie. And the people that are being referred to as Marutas right now are people. Back to the book. The world will probably never learn of all the grisly experiments that took place at Unit 731. Among them were pressure experiments, similar to those carried out by Dr. Rasher at Dachau concentration camp. Presumably done on behalf of the Japanese Air Force, it was an extremely painful method of killing. Individuals placed in the Unit 731 pressure chamber would suffer terrible agony as their eyes first popped out of their sockets as the eye membrane ruptured, and later as blood forced its way out through pores in the skin. Marutas had their blood siphoned off and replaced with horse blood in plasma experiments. It was said that a number of these poor men, women, and children who became Marutas were mummified alive in total dehydration experiments. They sweated to death under the heat of hot, dry fans. At death, their corpses weighed only 1/5 normal body weight. Others were electrocuted, boiled alive, killed in giant centrifuges, or died from prolonged exposure to X-rays. In all, some 3,000 are said to have been murdered. Some were just killed off when there was an excess of supply. They were killed like animals in an abattoir. Every bit of their bodies mercilessly used up in the name of the terrible medicine of military science.
Before we get to Dawkins here, this is what it means to go after other gods. When you see that phrase in the Old Testament that the people went after other gods, this is what going after other gods looks like. And when you read that in the Old Testament and you see the results, you see God's wrath being poured out on people who go after other gods. This is what the Old Testament is talking about. Situations like Unit 731, who carried out medical experiments on human beings in order to further their military objectives. That's what we're talking about here. So that's the context. And to give you a little more context, even something a little closer to us, time-wise, is the Gulf War. That was from World War II. Unit 731 was a detachment from the Japanese army in China, where they captured Chinese and did these horror show experiments on them. And we're going to talk about what should be done with such people as we progress through here. But let's go on to the Gulf War and the kind of horrors that were faced over there. Absolute nightmares.
You guys get out on patrol, and you guys are driving, and you see a boy, like a young boy, alone, and you stop the vehicles, and here we go to the book. Something ain't right, sir, Greason said in that sleepy Sam Elliott voice of his. The years of smoking and drinking had given it a gravely rugged quality, indomitable, really. Nope, I said, shaking my head under my helmet. Campbell was kneeling in front of the boy now, talking in a low, comforting voice. The boy whined, his head waving from side to side. He seemed disengaged, lost in his own tormented world. Who the hell would give dope to a little kid? Would the ANA do something like that? I thought. 15 feet from the boy, we both gasped and stopped in our tracks. Under a shock of dirt-encrusted black hair, we saw a disfigured face, about 6 years old. His eyes had been gouged out, the sockets burned black by whatever heated implement had been used to do the deed. Next to me, Greason exhaled sharp-iced. What is this? The boy opened his mouth again. Another whine spilled out between cracked lips. Behind them, we saw ruptured gums and no teeth. Get Yusuf and Doc Pantoja. Pantoja, how do you say his name? Pantoja, I said to my platoon sergeant. Yusuf reached us first and looked down at the boy. Either he'd seen this sort of thing before, or a half a decade of war had steeled him to such sights. The boy's condition evoked no visible emotions in my terp. He stood quietly next to me, his used car salesman affection stowed for the moment. And we haven't really talked about Yusuf much, but when you lost Abdul, Yusuf moved up into the primary interpreter position, and you describe him as a used car salesman. He's one of those guys that seems a little bit shady, but you're working with what you got.
That's right, yeah.
You end up taking the boy to a nearby village, and here you describe the village. The village was a frightful sight. A clean bed would have been a priceless luxury in this place. The mud-walled huts were barren of even the most basic essentials. Little food, no clean water. The ground between the dwellings was riddled with human feces, animal dung, and filth. The smell of such a place is one that none of us will ever forget. It lingered like a tangible presence in the air. I could feel it seeping into my clothing. For a second, I flashed back to my first day in country. After the girl had died in my arms, I had burned my blood-soaked ACUs. No amount of cleaning would ever get out this stench. A boy, perhaps 6 years old, limped out of a nearby hut and took station near one corner, watching us with burnished black eyes. There was a wary worldliness in them that I'd never seen back home. Welts and bruises ran the length of his face, neck, and arms. He'd been badly beaten. And then an ancient man, clad in dirt-marred clothes, emerged from one mud hut. His beard was dyed red, something that all village elders do to show their status as community leaders. When he saw us, he paused and offered a guarded greeting. Then he saw the eyeless boy. His composure cracked, and a look of pure love and relief crossed his face. He hurried over and wrapped the boy in his arms. The two shared words, and the elder held the boy in a fierce protective embrace. He looked at me, the boy's head tucked under his jaw and pressed hard against his neck, and I could see that the old man's eyes had grown wet. He began to speak to me. Yusuf listened, and then said in a clipped and professional tone, "The village elder thanks you. This boy is his grandson." Greason, his voice barely a whisper, said, "Yusuf, find out what happened to this kid." Yusuf nodded and engaged the village elder in a long discussion. We listened as the two conversed in their native language, anxiously awaiting the answer. At last, Yusef turned his attention to us, his face a mask, and matter-of-factly told us the elder's story. The enemy had swept into the village a few weeks ago, bent on punishing its inhabitants for supporting the coalition. I doubted that any Americans had ever visited this place. The enemy had kidnapped the elder's oldest grandson. He was the future of the family, the boy most cherished and revered in Afghan culture. Taking him was a blow that nobody in the village would forget. They had taken the elder's grandson back to one of their mountain hideouts where they gouged out his eyes. They had turned him into a sexual plaything, knocking out his teeth to increase their pleasure with him. They had raped this 6-year-old boy for weeks. So that's what you're dealing with.
Yeah, the enemy that we face over there, that's what they're capable of. In this village, there's no way that, we had never even come into contact with them. There were so many small border villages in the Hindu Kush Mountains that have not even talked to a tribe that's a click down the road, let alone ever seen an American troop. There's just the mere thought that they may have been working with Americans was enough to cause something like that. It just shows you the depth and depravity of the enemy that we're fighting. This is why we fight against them. This is why Americans are there. This is why we matter. This is why the way that we fight matters. There is a right and wrong to how the world, conducts itself. I firmly believe that, some cultures are better than others. I think our Western culture should be preserved and fought for and protected and promulgated as much as possible. We live in the best country on the face of the earth. Why shouldn't we try to do that for other people if and when we can? I know that that's probably a controversial view, but, I know that those people in Afghanistan, this village in particular, was so grateful for what we brought to them, how we helped them. We did a med cap in their village. So much of what we did in Afghanistan was taking care of the people. That was really important to us. We were the main power brokers in the AO. There's no question about that. We dominated the terrain. We kicked the enemy's ass, but we really did care about the Afghan people. In fact, that first engagement that we talked about today, we were going to do our initial tasking was to do an observation post, yes, but we were stopping off in a village to do a humanitarian distribution. Blankets, food, rice, coloring books, crayons for kids. And I remember getting back from that mission, pulling out this Crayola crayon box with a center punched hole of a 7.62 round right through the center of it. And so we cared a lot about the people, man. And the enemy in that first rocket attack where they killed a bunch of those kids didn't matter. They knew those rockets had landed in a school. They kept firing at us. There was an informant, a human intelligence informant that we were working with to help exploit high-value targets on the border early on in the deployment. He was one of the few people that lived in the mountainous border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan and had the courage to stay there throughout it all. Enemy found out that he was working and helping us, and they threw a grenade in the middle of his compound and killed a newborn baby, killed his baby. They just do terrible things to their kids, and that stays with you forever. It's I'm telling you, like I said before, I don't lose a wink of sleep over the bad guys that we killed over there. Don't lose a wink of sleep over it. But it's moments like this that stay with you forever. And I think you get a lot of time to think about this sort of when you're over there. It's because when you look at the kids and you're driving through these villages and they liked American troops. They appreciated what we did. They appreciated how we protected them. The people in Afghanistan and those children, they have nothing. nothing. There's no running water. There's no electricity. There's no roads. There's no economy. There's no jobs. The men all summer long go out there and they cut wood so they have enough wood to keep their family warm during the winter, and then the cycle starts again. And so these kids, though, I remember watching them from an observation post one day early on, like just watching them run around and play soccer with this deflated soccer ball and bare feet in the mountains, like running on these like rocks that had to be razor sharp. And I just thinking to myself, like, damn it, man, kids are the most amazing thing in the world. You know, it's because here they are. They don't even know. They have nothing. They literally have nothing. And probably one of the most dangerous places on the face of the planet. And here they are running around playing soccer. They don't even have shoes, you know. Running around playing soccer, being kids, you know, they're so awesome, you know, and that's why we were there, to protect them. And then to see, you know, the way that the enemy treated them, I knew we just had to kill as many of them as humanly possible. Like for the year that we were supposed to be there, we ended up being there a year and a half. But the year that we were there, I just felt from this point forward, like, yeah, we were in fights. You know, we weren't going to draw our weapon unless we were fired upon first, but all that changed after this.
You continue on here. More members of the elder's family ventured out. They came to the boy to hug and reassure him. He whimpered softly, and I wondered if he was crying. Then I realized he couldn't cry. His tear ducts had been burned away.
I mean, don't people that do that to young children, you know, don't people like that deserve to die?
Yes, 100%. I
mean, they don't deserve. Life is a privilege. Every single waking breath that you have is a privilege, you know, and they certainly don't earn it.
So again, this is what we're talking about when it comes to people going after other gods. Let what these men have spoken of in this podcast get indelibly ingrained in your mind when you're reading your Old Testament and they're talking about people going after other gods. And now we're going to contrast that with Dawkins' take of warfare in the Old Testament. Unless, you know, I need to remind you of people being frozen to death, people being dehydrated to death, people being starved to death by Unit 731 for military medical experimentation. A young boy, 6 years old, having his eyes gouged out by a hot knife and raped in the most horrific way a human can think of. This is what it means to go after other gods, and then tell me that God's wrath is not justified on such people. This happened barely a decade ago in Afghanistan. Don't tell me that this sort of thing wasn't going on as the Bible records it. We'll talk about these things. Let's get to Dawkins.
Why was Jephthah fighting the Ammonites in the first place, and why would God have helped him gain victory? The Old Testament is filled with bloody battles, and whenever the Israelites win, the credit is given to their bloodthirsty God of battles. The books of Joshua and Judges are largely about the campaign waged by the Israelites after Moses had led them out of captivity in Egypt to take over the Promised Land. This was the land of Israel, the land flowing with milk and honey. God helped them take it over by exterminating the unfortunate people who already lived there. God's orders here were not roundabout at all, but horribly clear. When you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their carved images and their cast idols, and demolish all their high places. Take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess. Numbers 33:51-3. For I have given you the land to possess. What? Is that a good motive for going to war? Adolf Hitler in the Second World War justified his invasion of Poland, Russia, and other lands to the east by saying that the superior German master race needed Lebensraum, or living space. And that is exactly what God was urging his own chosen people to claim by war. He was nice enough to make a distinction between those tribes who merely got in the way on the journey to the Promised Land and those tribes who already lived in the Promised Land itself. The first group were to be offered peace. If they agreed, they got off lightly. At worst, only the men were to be killed and the women taken as sex slaves. But less gentle treatment awaited the unfortunate peoples who actually lived in the Lebensraum, which God had promised his chosen people. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Deuteronomy 20:16. God really meant business, and his ruthless wishes were carried out to the letter, not just during the conquest of the Promised Land, but throughout the Old Testament. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. 1 Samuel 15:2. God's orders were to kill even children, especially boys. Girls are worth keeping for, well, read it for yourself and use your imagination. You won't need much. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Numbers 31:17-18. Nowadays we'd call it ethnic cleansing and child abuse. Theologians are embarrassed by these and the many similar passages in the Bible. They have reason to be grateful that modern archaeology and scholarship can find no evidence that any of these Old Testament stories are historically true. Theologians explain away the many horror stories as symbolic myths, moral tales, like Aesop's fables rather than history. Fair enough, although you might wonder how you could possibly find a decent moral in almost any of these terrible tales of violent bloodlust, fighting for Lebensraum, genocidal ethnic cleansing, and treating women and girls as the property of men, to be raped and used as sex slaves. Modern Christian theologians sometimes write off the Old Testament altogether. They point with relief to the New Testament, where Jesus comes across as a lot nicer than his terrifying Heavenly Father. Jesus himself was not so sure of the contrast. The Gospel of John has him saying, "I and the Father are one," and "The Father is in me and I am in the Father," and "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father."
So there's the contrast. Dawkins talks about these unfortunate people who already lived there. This is the myth of the noble savage. That these people in the land of Canaan were just these people living these tranquil, peaceful lives, when in reality, what's going on here is Moloch worship and Baal worship. To worship Baal and Moloch in particular was to take your newborn baby, take him to this idol that had his arms outstretched over a fire, and put that newborn baby into Moloch's arms and let it be burned alive. This is the horrors of going after other gods, and why God's wrath is poured out on them. Although we see many times in Scripture where God's wrath has stayed because of his mercy, because the sin is not yet completed. Said we'll talk about that more later. But this is the horrors of going after other gods, and we saw that from those extended clips from the Jocko podcast. Dawkins also compares the conquering of the promised land to Lebensraum. It's ironical, disgusting. It's anti-Semitic at best to say that the Jews conquering the promised land, these people wandering in the desert after being freed from Egyptian slavery, being used as an instrument of God's wrath on men who would gouge out young boys' eyes and knock out their teeth so they could have sexual, more comfortable sexual pleasure with them. Are these unfortunate people who already lived there. Question is, I would pose to Dawkins was wiping out the Nazis in World War II Lebensraum? What about Unit 731? Shouldn't something have been done about that? These people that tortured the little boy. I mean, it seems to me like that you're reading the story of a bunch of former slaves who defeat their captors and defeat a land of savages like this, like the ones Jocko talked about on his podcast, would be a good thing. But no, Dawkins twists this whole situation for his own agenda. And he's got it completely wrong. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, I know Dawkins knows what the scripture says. But yet he chooses to portray this as if it's some sort of Lebensraum, some sort of Nazi, we need breathing room type of agenda going on here. It's not for the land. If you actually read the scriptures, Genesis 15 and 18 show that the people are being driven out because of their sin. And when you think of sin, think of Unit 731. Think of the Nazis. Think of Afghanistan, where this boy was so terribly abused. They were being driven out, according to Leviticus 18, for their child sacrifices to Moloch. In Deuteronomy 9 tells us, after the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourselves, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. Dawkins completely ignores this passage. It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going to take possession of this land, but account of the wickedness of these nations. Wickedness we just witnessed in modern day times. In Unit 731, in Afghanistan, where they're gouging boys' eyes out with hot knives and raping them repeatedly. The Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Somehow, Dawkins missed this little passage, although I am completely convinced that he is aware of it. Women taken as sex slaves, not one passage in the Old Testament does it say that the Lord commanded Israel to take women as sex slaves. Not one passage. Deuteronomy 21, in fact, says this: when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home and have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother, who were former Nazis, let's keep it there, then you may go to her and be your husband, and she shall be your wife. If you're not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. But you must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. Dawkins misses this passage as well. Orders carried out to the letter? Well, let's think about this for a second. Ancient Near Eastern battle language was hyperbolic. We talk about, in this day and time, we talk about wiping people out. Compare this to Lieutenant Parnell's work in Afghanistan, how he said, these people do not deserve to live. This is what we're talking about here. And we know for a fact that the Canaanites were not ethnically cleansed because we have a Canaanite woman in the New Testament that comes begging to Jesus to heal her demon-possessed child. Even in Joshua, they weren't cleansed. There were people still hanging around there. Dawkins can read, but he selectively reads for his agenda, is the point here. One thing he misses is this idea of siege. And I want to read something to you about a siege. The siege is strictly forbidden in Holy Scripture, by the way. But let me read what a siege looks like in ancient Near Eastern setting. This comes from Josephus. Now those that perished by famine in the city, the number were prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war was commenced presently, and the dearest friends fell a fighting with one another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable supports of life. Nor would men believe that those who were dying had no food, but the robbers would search them when they were expiring, lest anyone should have concealed food in their bosoms and counterfeited dying. Nay, these robbers gaped for want, and ran about stumbling and staggering along like mad dogs, and reeling against the doors of the houses like drunken men. They would also, in the great distress they were in, rush into the very same houses 2 or 3 times in one and the same day. Moreover, their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew everything, while they gathered such things as the most sordid animals would not touch and endured to eat them. Nor did they at length abstain from girdles, shoes, and the very leather which belonged to their shields, and pulled off and gnawed. The very wisps of old hay became food to some, and some gathered up fibers, and sold a very small weight of them for 4 drachma. But why do I describe the shameless impudence that the famine brought on men in their eating inanimate things? Why am I going to relate a matter of fact, the like to which no one in history relates, either among the Greeks or barbarians? 'Tis horrible to speak of it, and incredible when heard. I had indeed willingly omitted this calamity of ours, that I may not seem to deliver what is so portentous to posterity, but that I have innumerable witnesses to it in my own age, and besides, my country would have little reason to thank me for suppressing the miseries that she underwent at this time. And Josephus is talking about this woman we're going to bring up here. There was a certain woman that dwelt beyond Jordan. Her name was Mary. Her father was Eleazar of the village of Bethzab, which signifies the house of hyssop. She was eminent for her family and her wealth, and had fled away to Jerusalem with the rest of the multitude, and was with them besieged therein at this time. The other effects of this woman had been already seized upon. Such I meant that she had brought with her out of Perea, and removed to the city. What she had treasured up besides, and also what food she had contrived to save, had also been carried off by the rapacious guards, who came every day running into her house for that purpose. This put the poor woman into a very great passion, and by the frequent reproaches and imprecations she cast at these rapacious villains, she had provoked them to anger against her. But none of them, either out of the indignation she had raised against herself, or out of commiseration of her case, would take away her life. And if she found any food, she perceived her labors were for others and not for herself. And it was now become impossible for her in any way to find any more food, while the famine pierced through her very bowels and marrow. When also her passion was fired to a degree beyond the famine itself. Nor did she consult with anything but with her passion and the necessity she was in. She then attempted a most unnatural thing, and snatching up her son, which was a child sucking at her breast, she said, O thou miserable infant, for whom shall I preserve thee in this war, this famine, and this sedition? As to the war with the Romans, if they preserve our lives, we must be slaves. The famine will also destroy us, even before that slavery comes upon us. Yet these seditious rogues are more terrible than both the other. Come on, be thou my food, And be thou a fury to these seditious varlets, and a byword to the world, which is all that is now wanting to complete the calamities of the Jews. As soon as she had said this, she slew her son, and roasted him, and ate one half of him, and kept the other half by her concealed. Upon this, the seditious came in presently, and smelling the horrid scent of the food, they threatened her, that they would cut her throat immediately if she did not show them what food she had gotten. She replied that she had saved a very fine portion of it for them, and withal uncovered what was left of her son. Hereupon they were seized with an horror, an amazement of mind, and stood astonished at the sight. When she said to them, This is my own son, and what hath been done with mine own doing? Come, eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself. Do you pretend to be either more tender than a woman, or more compassionate than a mother? But if you be so scrupulous, and do abominate this my sacrifice, as I have eaten the one half, let the rest be reserved at anything. After which those men went on. After this, those men went out trembling, being never so much affrighted as anything as they were at this. And with some difficulty, they left the rest of that meat to the mother. Upon which the whole city was full of this horrid action immediately. And while everybody laid this miserable case before their own eyes, they trembled as if this unheard of action had been done by themselves. So they were thus distressed by the famine, and very desirous to die. And those already dead were esteemed happy, because they had not lived long enough either to hear or to see of such miseries. This is the nature of the siege. If you're not familiar with the ancient siege, what happened was, if a military force was going to take a city, they would encircle it and cut off all its supplies. And the people would start to starve, and then they would attack the city and take it. And this is strictly forbidden in Holy Scripture. This doesn't happen. On top of that, the cities, quote unquote, that were talked about in the ancient Near East were, generally speaking, military strongholds. People didn't live in the cities. There was nothing for them in the cities. The cities were where the military kept control of the land. Most of the civilians lived in the countryside. Most of these cities that the Old Testament talks about were these military compounds, and they had fighting women and children in them. And the Lord tells them not to spare those, to go in and just overrun these military compounds, which, yes, had women and children. I mean, these were people who burnt their babies at the site of ancient idols like Molech. Do you not think they would not have their children fighting at their side in these military compounds? Of course they did. And that's still done today. I mean, we have these child soldiers in parts of the Middle East and Africa. So don't give me this idea that there's these noble savages living in this land that the Lord is pouring his wrath out on. No, this is what Lieutenant Parnell was talking about. That these people don't deserve to live, and God is pouring their wrath out on them. And by the way, while the Hebrews were enslaved for 450 years, he gave them plenty of opportunity to repent, and some of them did. Like Rahab. Anyway, to finish this off, I'm going to let Jocko answer this question about war and when it's necessary.
I saw tests in which Maruta were tied to crosses in a large circle as planes flew over and dropped bacteriological bombs in the area surrounded by the crosses. Their legs were chained and their bodies tied tightly. We observed the tests from a distance of about 200 meters. I had the job of cleaning up and disinfecting after the experiments and gathering debris lying around. than war. Because as stupid and as fearful and as reprehensible as war is, there is something worse than war. And that is allowing this kind of evil to exist. As bad as war is, and war is awful, war is hell, and I have said that over and over again, as have many others. But there are worse things than war. Things like Unit 731. Things like the Nazi concentration camps. Things like the rape of Nanking. There are things that are worse than war, and there are times when war is not only justified, but it is a moral obligation. And I do not say that lightly. But when evil and when darkness and when malevolent and demonic spirits rise to power, they must be stopped. And the responsibility for that lies within all of us every day to do our best. To do our best to move the world away from the darkness and the demons that linger inside men's minds.
When the darkness and the demons rise to power, we have to stop them. To quote Jocko, when the demons and the malevolence and the evil, somebody has to rise up to stop them. This is what the Lord God does in the Old Testament. These aren't noble savages. These aren't people that were just trying to take their land and their unfortunate inhabitants. Something more going on here. Read your Old Testament that way. That's how it should be read. That's how Dawkins should be reading it. But he's not. He's got an agenda. Thank you to all of you listening on KNNA The Cross of Nebraska. Thank you to Steve Kozar and the messedupchurch.com. Please check us out there. Please contribute to the Kenya Wall Project. And we'll soldier on next week. Take care.